There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the high altitudes of the Balkan interior, a silence shaped by stone, wind, and the weight of centuries. In the winter of 1948, that silence became absolute. In the rugged folds of the Pindus mountains, near the shifting borders of the post-war world, 15 mountain villages simply ceased to exist in the public record. They didn't vanish in a flash of violence or a natural disaster. Instead, they were systematically, physically isolated from the rest of civilization by a series of massive stone and timber barriers erected across every navigable pass. For decades, the story was dismissed as a logistical footnote of the Greek Civil War or the early maneuvering of the Iron Curtain. But when the first researchers were finally allowed back into these lost valleys in the late 1990s, they found that the official explanation didn't match the masonry left behind. Records suggest that the walls were built with a speed and precision that defied the technology of the time. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand why 15 communities were entombed in the mountains, we have to look at the atmosphere of 1948. Europe was a landscape of scars. The Second World War had ended, but in the high peaks of the Mediterranean borderlands, a new, more intimate conflict was raging. This was the era of the Truman Doctrine and the Cominform, a time when maps were being redrawn in blood and ink. The mountains were a sanctuary for partisans, refugees, and those who wished to be forgotten. Communication was already fragile, relying on mule tracks and the occasional telegraph wire. In early October of that year, the last of these wires went dead. According to regional military logs, the isolation was initially reported as a quarantine measure due to a suspected outbreak of typhus. It was a standard procedure for the era, a grim but necessary tool of statecraft. But as the weeks turned into months, the quarantine didn't lift. And that's when the first reports of the construction began to surface. The walling was not a single event, but a coordinated engineering project that stretched across a 60-mile arc of high-altitude terrain. Archive photographs from aerial reconnaissance missions, grainy, black-and-white images captured by low-flying scouts reveal the scale. These weren't mere roadblocks or military checkpoints. In the narrow gorges of the Vardar and the Aus, massive walls of dry stone masonry and reinforced timber were raised, some reaching heights of 20 feet. They were designed not just to stop vehicles, but to prevent any human passage whatsoever. Some historians believe these barriers were constructed by the villagers themselves under military duress, yet the logistics remain a point of contention. To move that much stone in the middle of a mountain winter would require thousands of laborers and an endless supply of calories. Yet, the official census records of the time show no such labor force was ever requisitioned. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In the village of Castanofito, one of the few locations where partial records survived, a diary belonging to a local schoolteacher named Eleni Varos provides a rare, ground-level perspective. Her entries from November 1948 describe a sense of growing dread that had nothing to do with the war in the lowlands. She wrote of the men in the grey coats who arrived not with guns, but with transit levels and heavy sledges. They didn't speak the local dialect, and they didn't take up residence in the houses. Instead, they camped at the mouth of the valley, working through the night under the glow of carbide lamps. Eleni noted that the villagers were not permitted to approach the construction sites, but they could hear the sound, a constant, rhythmic thudding that seemed to vibrate the very foundations of their stone cottages. It was the sound of a world being closed. And then, as the first heavy snows began to fall, the men in grey disappeared, leaving the villagers behind a wall of stone with no way out. This is where the official timeline begins to fracture. The Greek military archives, long kept under seal, suggest that the 15 villages were part of a strategic depopulation plan to deny shelter to communist insurgents. It was a brutal but logical military strategy of the period. However, the American military advisors who were on the ground at the time filed a series of confidential memos that suggest a different motivation. One memo, dated the 12th of December 1948, mentions unusual seismic activity localized within the very valleys that were being walled off. The memo notes that the sound of the construction was often indistinguishable from a low-frequency hum emanating from the earth itself. There is no clear consensus on whether the walls were built to keep the villagers in, or to keep something else from spreading out. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the winter of 1948 deepened into 1949, the 15 villages became a black hole on the map. No smoke was seen rising from the valleys. No messengers arrived at the nearest outposts. The few shepherds who attempted to climb the ridges to look down into the isolated basins returned with stories that were dismissed as mountain fever. They claimed that the villages were not just silent, but transformed. They spoke of a strange, shimmering quality to the air above the houses, and a total absence of birds. In a region where the golden eagle was a constant presence, the sky had gone empty. These stories, while dismissed by the urban elite, were taken seriously enough by the regional command that a special investigative unit was dispatched in the spring of 1949. But when the unit reached the first wall at the gorge of Vikos, they found it hadn't just been built, it had been fused. The investigative team, led by a Captain Nikolaos Gikas, reported that the dry stone wall had undergone a process of vitrification. The stones, which should have been loose and weathered, were bonded together as if they had been subjected to intense heat. It was a phenomenon that defied explanation in a pre-industrial mountain pass. Gikas's report, which was suppressed for nearly 40 years, noted that the surface of the wall was smooth to the touch, like glass, and cold enough to burn the skin. His men tried to use explosives to breach the barrier, but the report states that the blasts did little more than scorch the surface. It was as if the wall was absorbing the energy of the explosion. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Behind the wall, the silence was absolute. Gikas reported that his radio equipment ceased to function the moment they moved within 50 yards of the barrier. The needles of their compasses spun in useless circles. This suggests that the walling was more than just a physical isolation, it was an electromagnetic one. Some modern researchers believe that the 15 villages were the site of an accidental discovery, perhaps a natural mineral deposit with unusual properties, or an atmospheric anomaly that the military of the 1940s was ill-equipped to handle. But the personal stories of those who lived near the perimeter suggest a more unsettling reality. They didn't talk about minerals or magnets. They talked about the shifting of the stars. In the nearby town of Konitsa, elderly residents still recall the blue nights of late 1948. They describe a period of 3 weeks where the horizon over the walled-off mountains didn't go dark at sunset. Instead, the sky turned a deep, bruised violet, and the stars seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic light. It was beautiful, they said, but it was accompanied by a feeling of profound nausea. The livestock refused to graze in the direction of the high peaks, and the local well water took on a metallic tang. These symptoms are consistent with what we now recognize as radiation sickness, yet there was no known nuclear activity in the Balkans in 1948. The mystery only deepened when the regional command received a telegram from an unknown source, claiming that the 15 villages were no longer occupied by the living. The report from Captain Gikas was the last official communication for nearly 3 weeks. When he finally re-established contact, his voice on the radio was described by the operator as thin and trembling, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. He claimed his team had bypassed the vitrified wall at Vikos by ascending the limestone cliffs of the Ostraka Plateau, a feat of mountaineering that should have been impossible in the spring thaw. From that vantage point, they looked down into the valley of Kastanofito. What they saw through their binoculars didn't resemble a war zone or a quarantine camp. The village was perfectly intact. Smoke was not rising from the chimneys, but the stone houses appeared to be vibrating. Gikas described it as a visual hum, a distortion of the air that made the building seem to ripple like a reflection in a disturbed pond. And that's when things began to shift. The investigative unit descended into the valley on the 14th of April 1949. According to the recovered logs, they found the village square of Kastanofito exactly as it would have been on a Sunday morning. Carts were loaded with timber, and laundry was still clipped to the lines, frozen stiff by the mountain air. But there were no people, there were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, and most importantly, no animals. Even the vermin, the rats and crows that usually scavenge abandoned sites, were absent. As the soldiers moved from house to house, they found the interiors remarkably well preserved. In the schoolhouse, the diary of Eleni Varos sat open on a desk, the ink still dark and fresh. But the final entry, dated the 20th of December 1948, was not written in Greek. It consisted of a series of intricate geometric patterns, etched so deeply into the paper that the nib of the pen had torn through the parchment. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Beneath the village, in the limestone caverns that the Pindus mountains are famous for, Gikas's men discovered the source of the heat that had vitrified the walls. They found a series of boreholes, perfectly circular and descending hundreds of feet into the bedrock. These were not the work of 1940s mining equipment. The edges of the holes were smooth, fused into a black, obsidian-like substance. A Geiger counter brought in by the American advisors registered 0 radiation, yet the temperature in the tunnels remained a constant, sweltering 80 degrees, even as the world above was gripped by frost. Some historians believe these boreholes were part of a desperate, secret search for uranium or other rare earth minerals, a theory supported by the intense interest the British Foreign Office took in the region. But a minerals search doesn't explain why the military felt it necessary to seal the entire population behind a 20-foot wall of stone. As Gicas's report moved up the chain of command, the tone of the official response changed. Instead of sending reinforcements or medical teams, the regional headquarters issued an immediate order for sanitization. The 15 villages were not to be reclaimed. They were to be erased. In the summer of 1949, while the rest of Greece was celebrating the end of the civil war, a series of aerial sorties was launched over the dead zone. These were not standard bombing runs. Witnesses from the neighboring valleys reported seeing flashes of white light that lasted for seconds at a time, followed by a total, eerie silence. When the smoke cleared, the valleys were no longer accessible. Landslides, officially attributed to heavy rains and seismic instability, had choked the narrow passes, burying the vitrified walls under millions of tons of limestone. The 15 villages were gone, but that wasn't the strangest part. In the archives of the British Intelligence Service, a series of photographs from a 1950 overflight reveal a detail that the Greek military had missed, or perhaps ignored. In the center of what was once Kastanofito, where the village square had been, the earth had subsided into a perfect, massive crater. The crater was not the result of an explosion. The edges were clean, as if the ground had simply been deleted. Some geologists have suggested a sinkhole theory, pointing to the porous nature of Balkan karst topography. However, a sinkhole doesn't explain the light flashes or the electromagnetic interference that continued to plague the region for years. By 1951, the entire Pindus range around the 15 villages was declared a perpetual military exclusion zone. The maps were updated. The names of the villages were removed from the census. It was as if 15 communities had never existed. The silence lasted for nearly 40 years. During the Cold War, the Pindus exclusion zone became a subject of intense speculation among Western intelligence agencies. There were rumors of a Soviet experiment gone wrong, or a secret American listening post hidden in the peaks. But in 1992, following the collapse of the socialist regimes in the Balkans and the gradual opening of the Greek state archives, a new generation of researchers began to piece together the fragments of Operation Hemlock. They found that the men in grey described by Eleni Varos were not soldiers at all. According to pay stubs and transport manifests found in a mothballed warehouse in Thessaloniki, they were civilian contractors hired through a front company based in Switzerland. Their specialty wasn't mining or warfare. It was acoustic stabilization. This revelation shifted the investigation from the military to the scientific. If the goal was acoustic stabilization, what were they trying to stabilize? Records suggest that the Pindus Mountains sit atop a unique junction of tectonic plates, where the friction of the Earth's crust produces a rare phenomenon known as lithopiezosonic resonance. In simpler terms, under extreme pressure, the stone itself can generate sound and electricity. Some believe that in 1948, a natural shift in the mountain's roots triggered a resonance so powerful it became a physical threat, a sound that could vibrate buildings to pieces and disrupt the human nervous system. The walls, then, may not have been built to imprison the people, but to serve as a massive acoustic dampener, a physical mute button for a mountain that wouldn't stop screaming. But this theory leads to a much darker question. If the walls were built to dampen the sound, what happened to the people who were inside the echo chamber when the vibrations hit their peak? This is where the personal stories of the surrounding region become critical. In the 1990s, an investigative journalist named Marco Rossi tracked down 3 elderly men who had served in Captain Gicas's unit. Their accounts, given independently, shared a detail that was never included in the vitrification report. They claimed that as they entered Kastanofito, they heard voices. Not the voices of the living, but a replaying of the past. One soldier claimed he heard a wedding celebration that seemed to be coming from the empty air of the village square. Another heard the sound of a school bell ringing, even though the bell itself had been removed weeks prior. It was as if the environment had recorded the final moments of the village, trapped in a loop of sound. Rossi's research suggests that the acoustic intensity in the valley had reached a point where it was altering the physical properties of time and memory. This, some historians believe, is why the government ordered the sanitization. They weren't hiding a weapon. They were hiding a breach in reality that they couldn't control. The turning point in the modern understanding of the 1948 event came in 2004, when a team of independent geophysicists used ground-penetrating radar to look beneath the landslides that had buried the villages. They expected to find the ruins of stone cottages and the remains of the vitrified walls. Instead, the radar returns showed nothing. Not an empty space, but a total lack of data, a null zone where the radar pulses simply didn't return. It was as if the matter beneath the landslide had become invisible to modern instruments. This discovery reignited the debate over what actually happened during those blue nights of 1948. Was the isolation of the 15 villages a response to a natural disaster, or was it a controlled experiment in spatial exclusion? As the evidence layers continued to build, a new perspective emerged from a surprising source. A retired professor of linguistics at the University of Belgrade pointed out that the geometric patterns in Eleni Varos's diary were not random. They shared a striking similarity with ancient sound forms found in the monastic records of the Meteora, the famous monasteries in the air located just to the south. These records spoke of the voice of the stone, a phenomenon where the mountains themselves would occasionally produce a tone that would cause the world to thin. For centuries, the monks had used specific architectural techniques to deflect this sound. In 1948, it seems the acoustic stabilization team was attempting to do the same thing with modern masonry and timber. But according to the linguistic analysis, the patterns in Eleni's diary weren't a recording of the sound. They were a response to it. The response mentioned in Eleni Varos's diary, those deep geometric gouges in the parchment, suggests a terrifying possibility that some psychologists have called acoustic possession. If the frequency of the mountain was high enough, it could, in theory, bypass the auditory nerve and act directly on the motor cortex of the brain. The villagers weren't just hearing the sound, they were being written upon by it. This might explain the total absence of bodies found by Captain Gikas. If the resonance reached a certain threshold, the biological integrity of the inhabitants may have been compromised, leading to a collapse of a different kind. But as the investigation moved into the late 2000s, the focus shifted from what happened to the people to what the state did to hide it. The paper trail left by the sanitization of 1949 began to reveal a global coordination that far exceeded the needs of a local border skirmish. In the declassified archives of the International Red Cross in Geneva, a series of panicked memos from 1952 describe a population discrepancy in the Pindus region. The Red Cross had been attempting to reunite families separated by the Civil War, but they found that for 15 specific villages, there were no names on any refugee lists in either Greece, Yugoslavia, or Albania. It was as if 3,000 people had never entered the system of the living or the dead. When the Red Cross inquired with the Greek Ministry of Interior, they were met with a wall of bureaucracy. The villages were listed as voluntarily relocated to the Soviet bloc, a common occurrence during the war. However, no corresponding records ever appeared in the Eastern archives. The villagers of the 15 valleys were effectively erased from the human ledger, and that's when a modern discovery at the site changed the narrative entirely. In 2012, a high-altitude drone, equipped with LiDAR technology, a system that uses laser pulses to see through dense vegetation, and topsoil flew a grid pattern over the Pindus exclusion zone. The data it returned provided the first clear look at the terrain beneath the 1949 landslides. The imagery revealed that the villages hadn't just been buried, they had been systematically dismantled before the slides occurred. The LiDAR showed the foundations of the houses in Castanafito arranged in a perfect, repeating spiral pattern, a layout that didn't match the traditional haphazard sprawl of a mountain hamlet. This suggests that the acoustic stabilization team wasn't just building walls to block the sound. They were repositioning the very stones of the village to act as a resonator or a filter. The villages themselves had been turned into a machine. This leads to the most controversial interpretation of the 1948 event. Some researchers suggest that the walling was not a military necessity, but a massive, field-scale experiment in what we now call geophysics. In the late 1940s, both the East and the West were obsessed with the idea of controlling the environment as a weapon. If a specific mountain range could be tuned to produce a debilitating frequency, it would be the ultimate defensive barrier. The 15 villages, in this view, were the laboratory. The villagers were the test subjects. When the experiment reached a critical state, perhaps triggering the blue nights and the spatial distortions reported by witnesses, the project was terminated with extreme prejudice. The white flashes reported by the locals may have been the use of high-yield thermobaric explosives, designed to create the massive landslides that would entomb the evidence forever. But even the most advanced explosives cannot fully silence the Earth. In 2018, a team of independent seismologists placed a network of ultra-sensitive sensors around the perimeter of the Pindus dead zone. They recorded a persistent, low-frequency hum that peaks every December, coinciding with the anniversary of the 1948 walling. The sound is below the threshold of human hearing, but it is powerful enough to be picked up by equipment hundreds of miles away. It is a ghost of the original siren, a reminder that whatever was triggered in those valleys hasn't fully dissipated. Some believe that the null zone detected by radar in 2004 is still expanding, albeit at a rate of only a few centimeters per year. It is a slow, silent consumption of the physical world. The aftermath for the families of the lost 15 remains a quiet, private tragedy. In the mountain towns that border the exclusion zone, there are still families who light candles for relatives they haven't seen in 70 years. They don't talk to journalists, and they don't petition the government. There is a local saying in the Pindus: "The stone remembers what the tongue forgets." They believe that to speak of the villages is to draw the attention of the mountain, to risk awakening the frequency that took their ancestors. This cultural silence has been as effective at hiding the truth as any military wall. And yet, the physical evidence remains the vitrified stone, the geometric diaries, and the scars on the landscape that refuse to heal. As we look back at the events of 1948, we are forced to confront the limits of our historical record. We see a world emerging from the chaos of total war, a world where the line between science and superstition was often blurred by the desperation of the state. The walling of the 15 villages remains one of the most significant, yet least understood, anomalies of the early Cold War. It is a story of masonry and mystery, of a government that chose to bury what it couldn't control. Records suggest a logistical operation of immense scale, but they fail to capture the sensory reality of those who were inside the walls. They fail to explain why the stars turned violet, or why the air began to hum. Modern re-examinations continue, but they are hampered by the fact that the site remains a restricted military area. The Greek government maintains that the exclusion zone is necessary for national security and border integrity, a justification that has remained unchanged for 3/4 of a century. Until the landslides are excavated and the null zone is understood, the fate of the 3,000 villagers will remain a matter of speculation. Did they perish in the sanitization, or did the acoustic resonance transport them into a state of existence that our current understanding of physics cannot categorize? What happened next remains unclear, but the silence of the Pindus Mountains is no longer the silence of nature. It is the silence of a secret. In the end, the 1948 mountain walling serves as a haunting reminder of the power of isolation. By cutting off a community from the rest of the world, you don't just stop the flow of people, you stop the flow of truth. The 15 villages of the Pindus were not just isolated by stone and timber, they were isolated from history itself. And as the years turn into decades, the wall becomes more than just a barrier. It becomes a monument to the unknown. The mountain remains, the wind still whistles through the high gorges, and beneath the millions of tons of limestone, the villages of Castanafito and its neighbors wait for a voice that can finally explain why they were silenced. The mystery of the walling is not just about what was built, but about what was lost in the process. It is a testament to an era when the world was being remade, and certain parts of it were deemed too dangerous to keep. Whether the men in grey were soldiers, scientists, or something else entirely, their work remains intact, buried deep beneath the Balkan cast. And as long as the Pindus hum continues to register on our sensors, we are reminded that some doors, once closed, can never be truly reopened. The 15 villages are gone, but the echo of their disappearance continues to vibrate through the stone, a slow-burn mystery that refuses to fade into the mountain mist.